Hello, everyone. Miss Debbie here. Thanks for joining me today. Today, I have a special surprise. I'll be reading a chapter book. I may not get through the whole thing, so we'll have part two in the next video. So, this is one of my favorite books in the world. It's called Aliens for Breakfast, and it's about a little boy who poured his bowl of cereal and an alien popped out, and they have to save the world. So it's by Stephanie Spinner and Jonathan Etra. And this is a perfect book if you want to read. It's excellent for first, second, third, and fourth grade um, because there's only about 60 pages or so of the story, and it's not too difficult. So there's a lot of dialogue and things like that. But sit back, enjoy, and every once in a while, I'll show you a picture. Aliens for Breakfast. Published by Random House. Mom, I hate these sneakers. Richard Bickerstaff was getting dressed for school. You picked them out yourself last week, sweetie, his mother called from the kitchen. Last week they were okay. Today I hate them. Richard frowned at his feet. Why had he ever chosen these dumb black high tops? He should have gotten red leather running shoes like Dorf's. They were cool. But then Dorf was cool. He had just moved here. He'd only been in Richard's class for 2 days, but already the other kids were imitating him. And here he is putting on his high top black sneakers. The kids were copying Dorf's big smile, which showed off his perfect white teeth. And they were copying the way he dressed. On the first day he came to school, Dorf wore a red bowling shirt. It had his name, Dorf, spelled out on the pocket. The next day, Richard's best friend, Henry, wore a bowling shirt. It had Sylvia stitched on the pocket. Everyone thought it was pretty neat anyway. Richard poked around in his closet, which was full of old Space Lords of Gygrax comics. He didn't have a bowling shirt, and he knew it, but he looked anyway. Richard, finish dressing or you won't have time for breakfast, called his mother. Hurry up, I have some new cereal for you to try. Richard found a clean shirt and put it on. I hate cereal, he said as he came into the kitchen. He scowled at his cereal bowl. It was full of strange little brightly colored shapes. And this stuff is looking at me, he added. All the strange little shapes had tiny silver eyes. It's called Alien Crisp, said his mother. She poured some milk into Richard's bowl. I thought you'd like it since you're such a sci-fi fan. The little shapes seemed to grow as the milk touched them. Then everything in the bowl heaved and sighed. Richard put down his spoon. Mom, where did you find this stuff? It's alive. Richard, your imagination is getting out of hand, said his mother. It's a free sample. I found it in the mailbox. But it's moving. The milk is making it move. The milk is standing still. The cereal is moving. Well, wait until it stops moving, then eat it, said Mrs. Bickerstaff. I have to get ready for work. Mrs. Bickerstaff was a lawyer. She almost never minded arguing, except when she was in a hurry like now. I don't think it's cereal, muttered Richard as she hurried out of the kitchen. He picked up the cereal box. Alien Crisp, it said on the front. Crunchy, munchy aliens in a box, packed on the planet Ganoob and rushed straight to you. Richard eyed his bowl. Everything in it had stopped moving. Then the milk gave a tiny splash. A round pink thing, the color of chewed bubblegum, started to climb up the side of the bowl. Amazed, Richard touched it with his spoon. Stop that! The words came directly into Richard's head. He put his spoon down very quickly. Then he took off his glasses and wiped them on his shirt sleeve. But when he put them back, the thing was still there. "What do you think you're doing?" asked the voice. Eating breakfast," answered Richard. Was a piece of cereal really talking to him? It was. "I could use some breakfast myself," it said. It crawled out of the bowl and dropped onto the table. "The trip really took it out of me." Richard finally found his voice. "Who are you?" he asked. "Arik, commander of the Interspace Brigade. Our goal, to wipe out cosmic troublemakers. Our record, 98% success." And here's the here's the alien in his cereal bowl. "You're an alien?" squeaked Richard. All those books he'd read about kids meeting aliens, and now it looked like it was happening to him. Him, Richard Bickerstaff. "I am a Ganubian," said Eric. "You are the alien." "I've got to be dreaming," thought Richard. He sometimes had very exciting dreams about space travel and large but friendly creatures from other planets who made him their leader. "Well, come on, do not just sit there," said Arik. His voice was awfully loud for such a little thing. It boomed inside Richard's head. "Let us get going. I am busy. I have 6 other planets to save. Move it or lose it. Hup, hup, hup." "Wait a minute," said Richard. "Where are we going? Who are we fighting? What about school? I'm going to be late." "Hey, it is your planet," said Arik, "and you have been chosen to help me save it. But if you do not mind the drains taking over, hunky-dory." He started to climb back into Richard's cereal bowl. Who are the drains? Richard wondered, if they were tiny and pink like Arik. "Space trash," said Arik. "Mean, very mean. When the drains see a planet they like, they move in. Before the natives know it, their minds are mush and the drains are in control forever." "And these drains, they're here?" asked Richard. "Yes, they are here. Or to be precise, one is here. But one is more than enough. Drains divide every 4 days. In a few weeks, Earth will be knee-deep in them. Not a pretty sight." "What does this drain look like?" asked Richard. "Well, drains can look like anything they want to. The one here has blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile no one can resist. He is in your class. He just showed up 2 days ago." "Dorf? Dorf is an alien?" Richard was so excited he jumped out of his chair. He couldn't wait to tell Henry. "My job is to get rid of the drain before he divides," said Arik. Then for a moment he looked a little confused. "You have suitable weapons, of course." "Weapons? All I've got is a water gun." Somehow Richard knew that wouldn't be enough to stop a drain. Arik sat down on the table. "Maybe it is because I am not used to being soaked in milk," he said, "but I cannot remember." "You can't remember what?" asked Richard. "The weapon to use against the drain." Arik looked confused again. "You mean you didn't bring weapons with you on your spaceship?" "I have no ship," said the little alien. "Then how did you get here?" "I was freeze-dried and beamed from Ganub in a cereal box. Fast and cheap," said Arik. "Well, have them beam the right weapons down," said Richard. "No, no, you do not understand," said Arik. "The weapon is here on your planet. That is why I did not bring it. It is something found in many earthling homes. Only now," he scratched his little pink head, "I cannot remember what it is." "Richard," called Mrs. Bickerstaff, "school bus is here." Richard scooped up his books and his lunchbox. "Look," he said, "I'm just a kid and I have to go to school. You're the space warrior. You figure out what to do." To Richard's surprise, Arik jumped onto his shoulder. "I am coming with you," he said. "Perhaps I will regain my memory when I see the drain. Let us go forth." Richard plucked Arik off his shoulder. He tucked him gently into his shirt pocket. "Bye, Mom," he called. "I'm off to save the world." "Have fun, sweetie," answered Mrs. Bickerstaff. You see the little alien in his pocket. Isn't this exciting? I love this. Chapter 2. Richard slid into his seat just as math was starting. He was under strict orders from Eric to act normal. "Do not let anyone know about me," he had told Richard on the way to school. "If the drain finds out I am here, you could kiss this planet goodbye." So now Richard couldn't stare at Dorf, even though he wanted to. Instead, he had to pretend that the only thing on his mind was the question Mrs. Marks was asking. As usual, it was a hard one. "Who knows how many ways we can make change for $1?" she asked. She looked around the room slowly. Then she stared straight at Richard. His heart sank. "Richard?" she asked. Richard knew you could get 4 quarters or 10 dimes or 100 pennies from $1, but that was too easy. This was a trick question with a trick answer. Only he didn't know the answer. "Any ideas, Richard?" asked Mrs. Marks. 4? Only 4? 5, he said quickly. He would have to bluff. "Who thinks there are more?" asked Mrs. Marks. "There must be at least 10, called Henry. He was good at trick questions. "What about a mixture of nickels, dimes, and pennies, or nickels, quarters, and $half?" "$half," thought Richard. "I forgot those." Then Dorf raised his hand. He had a big smile on his face. It showed off his perfect white teeth. "Yes, Dorf," said Mrs. Marks. "There are 292 ways to change a dollar bill," said Dorf. All the kids in the class stared at Dorf. How had he come up with that number? "Good guess," exclaimed Mrs. Marks. "It's not a guess," said Dorf. "I figured it out last summer on my computer." "Well, you're very clever indeed," said Mrs. Marks, "because that is the right answer. Can anyone explain why?" Her eyes moved up and down the rows. Richard tried to look invisible. And here is the class. There's Richard. And there's Dorf. "You have pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, and $half," continued Dorf. 136 coins in all. But you can mix them in all kinds of ways, like 5 pennies, 2 dimes, 5 nickels, and a $half. Or 45 pennies, a nickel, and 2 quarters. There are hundreds of ways to do it. 292 ways, to be exact, he finished smoothly. Mrs. Marks didn't smile a lot, but she smiled now, and everyone in the class nodded as if Dorf had just said something important and wonderful. "He has begun to control their minds," said Eric. Richard jumped. For a moment he had forgotten about the alien in his pocket. Now he felt the thrill of alarm at Eric's words. What should he do? "I told you before," said Eric's voice. "Just act normal. Do you understand?" "Yes," said Richard silently, sensing that Eric could hear his thoughts. He felt hot and nervous, but at least math was over. He walked over to Henry's seat with his lunchbox. They always traded sandwiches after math. Richard's mother made him tuna on whole wheat, which he hated. Henry's mother made him peanut butter and jelly, which he hated. So they traded. But when Richard got to Henry was already eating a sandwich. It looked like tuna fish. Dorf was sitting next to Henry. He was eating a sandwich too. It looked like peanut butter and jelly. "Hey," said Richard, "don't you want to trade?" "Already have," said Henry, with his mouth full. "I traded with Dorf." His eyes, when he turned to Richard, looked funny, almost as if they weren't focused right. "But we always trade," said Richard. "Here, Richard, have half of mine," said Dorf. He offered his peanut butter and jelly with a smile. Do not look at his teeth, Eric's voice popped into Richard's mind. They send out dangerous drain rays that will bring you under his control. Look only into his eyes. They cannot harm you. Richard took a deep breath and turned to Henry. I hate tuna fish, he said, and we always trade. How could you give my sandwich away? It's not your sandwich. Anyway, Dorf got to me first, said Henry. Richard sputtered with anger. He's a... Before he could say drain monster, Henry broke in. He's a great guy, said Henry. His mouth was still full of tuna fish. He's got his own VCR and all the Mad Max tapes, and he's going to let me watch them on Saturday. Why don't you come too, said Dorf. A whole bunch of kids from the class are coming. It'll be fun. I hate Mad Max, said Richard, though this wasn't true. Then he saw that Henry was staring straight at Dorf, right at Dorf's perfect smile. And besides, I'm already busy, he finished weakly. Then he sat down at his desk and looked blankly at his tuna sandwich. Earth is in big trouble, thought Richard Bickerstaff. And here's Henry gazing at Dorf's teeth, and there's Richard. Chapter 3. All day, Richard kept waiting for Eric to remember what the secret weapon was. But Eric didn't remember. Instead, he complained. He whined about having to stay in Richard's pocket. He made rude remarks about the classes he had to sit through. The only time he stopped complaining was during gym. Then he sat in the pocket of Richard's shorts and didn't make a sound. After gym, he confessed that the smell of the basketball reminded him of Ingvar, his girlfriend, on Ganoob. But at last, the school day was almost over. Only Art was left, Richard's favorite. He had been working for weeks on a drawing of the Starship Enterprise. Now it was nearly finished. He settled down and got to work. Using a silver crayon, he drew in one last fin on the ship's side. Isn't this great? He asked Eric silently. Now that he knew he could send thoughts to the little alien, he was beginning to like it. And here is Richard drawing. There's Eric in his pocket. Primitive, answered Eric. Besides, interspace beaming is much cheaper. But what if you don't know exactly where you're going? Captain Kirk never has a destination. He spends his time on the Enterprise exploring space, looking for strange new worlds. Get real. We have enough problems with the worlds we know already. Thanks to our friends the Drains, in case you had forgotten. Richard threw down his crayon. How could I forget? He said out loud. Too late, he remembered about sending the thought silently. What if someone in class heard him talking to himself? They would think he was crazy. But no one even looked at him. His whole class was watching in silence as Dorf worked on his art project. Richard wondered why everyone was so impressed. After all, it was only a little white paper pyramid. Mrs. Logan walked over to Dorf's desk. Dorf smiled one of his big smiles up at her. Her eyes got a little funny and glassy as she smiled back. How beautiful, she said to Dorf. So three-dimensional. Henry was sitting next to Dorf. He stared at Dorf's pyramid for a long time. Then he stared at his own crayon drawing of two dinosaurs. Then he looked back at Dorf's pyramid again. Mrs. Logan, can I make something new? He asked. What would you like to make, Henry? Asked Mrs. Logan. Something three-dimensional, like Dorf. What a nice idea, said Mrs. Logan. Of course, go ahead. Then Celia raised her hand. She was drawing a picture of dancing jelly beans. Me too, she said. Me too, said Jennifer, Ruth, Philip, George, Leroy, Fawn, Dawn, Sean, and Tristram. Mrs. Logan looked pleased. If you'd all like to try something new, go right ahead, she said. The whole class got up. They walked to the supply table and took what was left of the white paper. Then they walked back to their seats and began making little white pyramids. They look like a bunch of robots, thought Richard. Mrs. Logan came over to him. Is something wrong? She asked. Don't you want to try something new too? Not really, said Richard. I haven't finished my starship yet. Suddenly, Mrs. Logan leaned closer. What's that on your hand? She asked. Are you bleeding? Richard looked at his fingers. Yikes, the tips were bright red. Blood was oozing out from under his fingernails. Richard grabbed his hand. How did this happen? I didn't even cut myself, I'm sure of it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Dorf smile. Why? Do not look at his teeth, Eric told him. Get out of class. You'd better go to the nurse, said Mrs. Logan. She'll take care of you. Richard stood, holding his hand up stiffly. Henry tore his eyes away from his pyramid. Does it hurt? He asked. No, said Richard, as if it were no big deal. The truth was, it didn't hurt, but it scared him. He knew he hadn't cut himself, or had he? You did not, Eric told him on the way to the nurse's office. I am sorry to have to break this to you. Dorf knows you are resisting him, so he's pulling a cheap drain trick. He is rearranging your molecules. You are melting. Richard stopped in his tracks. Melting? Well, dissolving is more like it, said Eric. Your molecules are drifting apart, slowly, of course. They were outside the nurse's office. This is terrible, moaned Richard. How had he ever thought getting to know an alien would be fun? He felt like throwing up. It will not get much worse today or tomorrow, said Eric, but I hope you do not have big plans for the weekend. Richard whimpered. Once I remember the secret weapon, I can destroy Dorf. Then you will be fine, said Eric. But what if you don't remember? If I do not remember, said Eric, Earth will be so deep in drains that dissolving will be fun. Chapter 4. Back in his own room after school, Richard looked at his bandaged fingers and tried to fight his panic. It wasn't easy. The fact that his fingertips had started to ache made it even harder. He thought of Dorf and shuddered. Listen, Eric, he said as calmly as he could. Don't you think we should do some serious thinking about how to get rid of Dorf? I mean, are you sure you don't have some super powerful weapon stashed away? How about a sub-ion warp disruptor? That was what the space lords of Gygrax used to blow away their enemies. It always worked, at least in the comics. Eric jumped down off the stack of Yoda comics on Richard's shelf. He came to rest on the shoulders of a plastic King Kong. Fancy weapons are too expensive for us. There he is on the King Kong. Fancy weapons are too expensive for us, Richard, he said. The Interspace Brigade works on a very tight budget. We have 47 million planets to look after. Our yearly allowance is 249 billion dactyls. That comes to about 67 cents a planet. 67 cents to save Earth? Shouted Richard. That's it? That is plenty, said Eric. We saved Dweeb for 36 cents 2 years ago. Drains are a cheap menace. They can be fought with simple ingredients. Like what? Yelled Richard. It will come to me, said Eric. Just give me time. I can't believe it, said Richard. My planet is being taken over by space hoodlums. I'm melting, and you, the commander of the Interspace Brigade, can't remember a simple ingredient. His toes began to throb. Were they bleeding like his fingers? He was too scared to take off his high tops and look. I never said I was perfect, snapped Eric. He slipped down off King Kong and started pacing. Then he stopped. Perhaps I could look around your house. It might bring back my memory, he said. Sure, where do you want to start? Garage, kitchen, bathroom? I seem to remember that the substance can be eaten, said Eric. Where do you store items of nourishment? In the kitchen, cried Richard. He grabbed Eric and headed down the hall. 10 minutes later, the Bickerstaff kitchen looked like a supermarket after an earthquake. The floor was covered with the contents of the refrigerator. Now Richard was emptying all the shelves. As he did, he showed each item to Eric. This is peanut butter. This is hot chocolate. This is rice. These are graham crackers. These are pickles. These are soft drinks. Tab for Mom, Dr. Pepper for me. Salt, sugar, tuna. See anything that will kill a drain? I do not think so, said Eric. He was sitting on a bunch of grapes, and I really thought I would remember it right away. Dorf hasn't clouded your mind, has he? Asked Richard. This is an easy mission, said Eric. I wiped out drains on lots of other planets, though I have never been freeze-dried before. It must have shaken me up. He sighed. We had better keep looking. Richard got back to work. How about these? He asked. Chocolate sprinkles for ice cream. Afraid not, said Eric. Is this all? The floor, the counters, the kitchen table, and chairs were now covered with bottles, boxes, cans, and jars of food. Yes, said Richard. It is not here, said the alien. Perhaps we can search some other Earthling's home, one with a wider range of products. We have the best kitchen on the planet, said Richard. Mom buys everything. If it isn't here, I don't know where it could be. Then he had an idea. Unless you want to go to the mall. Is there food at the mall? Every fast food made in America. Then by all means, let us go there, said Eric. And quickly. So we're going to end there for now. This is chapters 1-4 of Aliens for Breakfast. When you want to hear the rest of the book, just tune in to the next video. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Okay.